Okay, thank you. I get the honor and I have the job of being your sustainability instructor today. My presentation today is, that's me, I'm Derek Sabori, that's a big picture. Sustainability 101 today is a crash course. Let me get my glasses. So it's a crash course. My goal today, I get to be the opening act for the rest of the speakers. So I want to share what I've learned. I'm not necessarily presenting a lot of solutions today. You'll see a lot of resources in my presentation, but this is not necessarily a how-to, but instead where you can go to learn more, what kind of things have kind of made the sustainability movement what it is. I'd like to add context to their talks and help you prepare for the concepts that you're going to hear about today from all of our speakers, help highlight the importance of the work that they are committed to. And like I said, this should be a resource guide for you, so let's get this class started. And if it feels like a lecture, it is a little bit of a lecture. I'm a teacher too, so sorry. But sustainability, so much buzz, right? Sustainability has maybe reached a tipping point by the look of the audience here and the size of the attendance. I think we have. You see it mentioned in news headlines and books, articles, in the classroom, sometimes trade shows and ads. Sometimes they're uplifting headlines, sometimes not so much. But what does it even mean? Are we all referring to the same thing when we're talking about sustainability? Are we driving forward the same concept for the same reasons? And how would you define sustainability? And if we had time, I'd go around the room and ask you to define it. But we can say maybe it's the ability to be maintained at a certain rate, or it's the avoidance of the depletion of natural resources. It's about finding balance. But it's been this definition that has come to be the most lasting. So in 1987, a UN commission released a report that offered this definition. It's a universally accepted one that I think still makes good sense today. Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So that means it's about us today, it's about our kids, their kids, so on and so forth. They deserve at least the same that we came into this party with. But how did we get here, and why are we here? Why is it that we are stuck frantically searching for fixes and solutions to decisions that were made 250 years ago? So this story does indeed start back somewhere in the early 18th century. So I want to do a little rewind to help better understand why we're here, how we got here. You'll trust me, there's a connection here. I've highlighted some historically significant events that have helped define how we look at sustainability today, and especially in the apparel industry. So this opening act will take us from the Industrial Revolution to labor rights and unionization, and then from conservation to the scientific intangible, and then to the actionable. So, Britain, early 18th century. As Britain approached the 1700s, they were running out of trees to use as fuel for heating and cooking, but guess what they found to replace that wood? Coal, right? It was abundant at relatively shallow levels, and in 1698, the steam engine was patented to, guess what? Pump water out of coal mines. So how does this relate to our industry? Is our industry indeed tied to the Industrial Revolution? Well, it was a string of events that stem from the textile industry that did actually help fuel the Industrial Revolution. And the story goes something like this. Think British textile industry. It all starts with wool, which was the dominant fiber at the time. And by 1750, it was one of Britain's oldest industries and the major source of wealth for the country. Cotton, however, was more comfortable, more versatile. Outer known, they're not here yet, but they might have something else to say about that. But in fact, wool was so important and cotton was such a threat that the British government passed a law in 1721 that banned the wearing of printed fabrics. These were the Calico Acts, as they were called. They were designed to restrict the growth of cotton and to protect the wool industry. The acts, however, they were repealed in 1774, and demand for cotton soon boomed. Steady demand then caused innovators to invest in ways to speed up the production and improve production, and by 1833, Britain's cotton industry was seeing rapid growth as they imported more and more raw cotton from the American colonies and the West Indies. The invention of the flying shuttle by John Kay in 1733, this increases the speed of weaving, creating demand for yarn, which led to inventions in the late 1700s like the spinning jenny, the water frame, the power loom. These each made it easier and faster to yarn spin and weave those yarns. These processes were then mechanized using water power, and they were eventually one of the first industries to do so, powered by the steam engine, ultimately leading to large cotton mills. So now on the topic of steam engines, the most successful steam engine was Thomas Newcomen's, whose engine was made possible not only railroads and steamboats, but ever more efficient cotton mills. And thanks to new industrial methods, we were now able to use something besides stale urine to bleach our cotton clothes. It's true, you can look it up. We were now turning to sulfuric acid. Sulfuric acid was created in large quantities thanks to lead-lined chambers. This was known as the lead chamber process. And this lead chamber process would not have been possible without lead production rising dramatically around 1750 in Britain thanks to lead foundries that were powered by, you guessed it, coal. So all of these things came together to make more yarn that could be spun and bleached faster and cheaper than ever before. So more cotton, more steam, more coal. And so yes, from there on out, the birth of the Industrial Revolution, we, the textile and apparel industry, we'd be tied intimately to natural resource utilization and the reliance on finite resources with an insatiable appetite for growth. So it's 1846. Things start ramping up in our industry thanks to Elias Howe and the invention of the sewing machine, and thanks to Isaac Singer, you'll recognize that name, who brings it to the market. The sewing machine allows for industrialized garment construction, and throughout the 1800s, the textile and apparel industry continues to scale up, relying on immigrant, often minor workforce working in poor and unsafe working conditions. And while there were earlier movements, and ones outside of the US, focusing on the environment now, one of the key moments of conservation and preservation comes with the founding of the Sierra Club. You've heard of them, and they have upwards today of 3.5 million members. At the time, they were just sponsoring wilderness outings in the mountain regions of the Pacific coast. Their first conservation campaign led to the defeat of a proposed reduction in the boundaries of Yosemite National Park. So here, early on, we see environmentalism at the time really focused on conservation and preservation and the conservation of natural lands. It's 1903. John Muir, Sierra Club's first president, convinces then President Theodore Roosevelt to go camping. And Muir's 3-night camping trip with President Theodore Roosevelt is considered probably the most significant camping trip in conservation history. Muir was able to persuade Roosevelt to return Yosemite Valley and Mariposa Grove to federal protection, and the national park system is born. And in fact, in 1901, Roosevelt said, with words that to me look slightly ahead of their time, he said, "We have become great because of the lavish use of our resources, but the time has come to inquire seriously what will happen when our forests are gone, when the coal, the iron, the oil, and the gas are exhausted, when the soils have still further impoverished and washed into the streams, polluting the rivers, denuding the fields, and obstructing navigation." So it takes visionary leadership, I think, to make things happen. 1911, by the early 20th century, demand for ready-to-wear clothing is proliferating thanks to department stores. But sadly, as it will be numerous times after, it's tragedy that brings awareness to worker conditions. And on March 25th, 1911, the Triangle Shirtwaist Company factory in New York City burned, killing 145 workers. It's remembered as one of the most infamous incidents in American industrial history. Tragically, those deaths were largely preventable. Most of the victims died as a result of neglected safety features, locked doors within the factory building. The tragedy brought widespread attention to the dangerous sweatshop conditions in factories at the time, and it led to a series of laws and regulations that better protected the safety of workers, and in fact, it spurred the growth of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, which fought for better working conditions for sweatshop workers. So now we're at 1990. It's the birth of the ILO, created as part of the Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I. The ILO, or the International Labor Organization, they're celebrating their 100th year this year. They held the belief that social justice is essential to universal and lasting peace. And social justice, the idea where all people should have equal access to wealth, health, well-being, justice, and opportunity. It's the only tripartite UN agency. They bring together governments, employers, and workers all with an equal voice to set labor standards, develop policies, and devise programs promoting decent work for all women and men. And the ILO developed an international labor standard and eventually formed the ILO Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work. These are core principles that are probably in the code of conduct that most of you are working under. 4 of them here: freedom of association and the right to collective bargaining, elimination of all forms of forced labor, effective abolition of child labor, and elimination of discrimination at work. And in 1938, we moved from better working conditions to better wages. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 originated in President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. It was a landmark piece of legislation, had significant impact on the labor movement in the United States. And under this act, the first minimum wage was established, a whopping 25 cents an hour. So it's 1949 now, and President Truman calls a meeting of the nations again with leadership, where he says the real or exaggerated fear of resource shortages and declining standards of living has in the past involved nations in warfare. Every member of the United Nations is deeply interested in preventing a recurrence of that fear and of those consequences. Conservation, he says, can become a major basis of peace. So this was the UN Scientific Conference on the Conservation and Utilization of Resources that took place in 1949. 1962, we moved from protecting things that we can see and enjoy, like lands and parks, to relying on science. Rachel Carson, a writer, scientist, and ecologist, publishes Silent Spring, sold more than 500,000 copies in 24 countries. And this is a book that's less about conservation and more about science, like I said, documenting the adverse environmental effects that were caused by the indiscriminate use of pesticides that were put to use in general society after being tested in the war, namely DDT. The book raised important questions about humankind's impact on nature and the interconnectedness that we have to it, and it helped set the stage for the modern environmental movement. The most important legacy of Silent Spring, though, was a new public awareness that was brought to how vulnerable humans are to nature, the intervention that we have with nature. It's 1970, Earth Day, considered by most as the birth of the modern environmental movement. Earth Day gave voice to the emerging consciousness that arose from Silent Spring and harnessed and channeled the energy of the anti-war protest movement, and it put the environmental concerns on the front page. Founded by Senator Gaylord Nelson of Wisconsin, after witnessing the ravages of the massive oil spill that occurred here in California up in Santa Barbara in '69, he announced the idea for it. It originated as a national teach-in on the environment, and in a bipartisan move, he persuaded a conservation-minded Republican congressman to serve as his chair. He recruited a law student from Harvard. They built a national staff, and on April 22nd, 1970, 20 million Americans took to the streets, parks, and auditoriums to demonstrate for a healthy, sustainable environment in massive coast-to-coast rallies. And it was 1987 when commissioned by the UN, that the Brundtland Report, also called Our Common Future, is released. It's a publication done by the World Commission on Environment and Development. This introduced the concept of sustainable development and described how it could be achieved. This was that definition that I talked about in the early slides. 1990, Earth Day goes global, mobilizing 200 million people in 141 countries. It lifts environmental issues onto a world stage now. Earth Day 1990 gave a huge boost to recycling efforts worldwide and helped pave the way for this one. The 1992 United Earth Summit Rio and Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. This was created as a response to member states to cooperate together internationally on development issues after the Cold War. It was created due to the belief that issues relating to sustainability were too big for individual member states to handle alone. Conference produced numerous declarations to address forests, desertification, and climate change. And that was 1994, and by the mid-90s, we're realizing, though, that sustainability is more than just about the environment, as the triple bottom line concept is introduced, thanks to Paul Hawken, who is an environmentalist, entrepreneur, author, and activist, and the author of The Ecology of Commerce, and John Elkington, author and sustainability consultant, who coined the phrase triple bottom line, which is people, planet, and profit. The Ecology of Commerce, though, is an important read that addresses the necessity of merging good business practices with common sense environmental concerns. It argues why business success and sustainable environmental practices, as the author says, need not and for the sake of our planet must not be mutually exclusive any longer. 1996, another movement for fair labor. President Clinton brings together multinational companies and NGOs at the White House and challenged them to work together to improve working conditions in the apparel and footwear sector. The group became the Fair Labor Association, a nonprofit organization that was incorporated in 1999, as of which a handful of you brands in the audience are members of. 2002, the seminal book, My Roadmap, and hopefully soon to be yours, Cradle to Cradle. I have my prop over there. It's published. It's a book by Michael Bronhart and William McDonough. It teaches us that waste is food, that everything is made of and ends up being one of two nutrients, either biological or technical. It puts emphasis on redesigning and rethinking what we have told ourselves, and that we need to move from a linear way of making things, which is this idea of take, make, and dispose, to a circular one, right, where nothing ever goes away. We just use it as a resource and put it out back into the stream and use it over and over again. And nearly 20 years later, circularity is finally playing center stage. 2007, Annie Leonard's influential story of stuff reminds us of where our stuff comes from, talks about things like planned obsolescence, linear business models, the complexities of the supply chain, and the impacts that our products have on people. 2011, Greenpeace rocks the apparel industry with the launch of the Detox campaign, challenging Nike and Adidas specifically to be the first clean water champions, asking them to team up with their suppliers and eliminate all toxic, persistent, and hormone-disrupting chemicals from their products and production processes, after revealing that toxic water effluent was leaking directly into community waterways. It ends up being Puma that makes the first move, but the campaign leads to a collaborative effort and a coalition that created the roadmap to follow called the Zero Discharge of Hazardous Chemicals, or the ZDHC. And on this topic, if you haven't watched the movie River Blue already, I highly suggest and recommend that you do. 2013, human disaster strikes again when Rana Plaza, the deadliest garment factory disaster ever occurs. More than 1,100 people died during the Rana Plaza collapse. Thousands more were injured. After the disaster, murder charges were brought against 38 people connected, and in reaction, more than 200 apparel companies from 20 countries signed the Accord on Fire and Building Safety in Bangladesh to prevent similar tragedies from happening. So if you haven't watched the movie True Cost, that also is a must-see. And in response to the tragedy, and with emphasis on supply chain traceability and transparency, Fashion Revolution campaign and organization was formed, asking brands and consumers and the industry to ask, who made my clothes? 2015 is the same year of the Paris Climate Agreement. Anybody remember that? After numerous UN climate and humanitarian initiatives and conferences, the UN releases these, the UN SDGs. The world's best plan, as they say, or a roadmap to build a better world for people and our planet by 2030. It's adopted by all United Nations member states in 2015. These are a call for action by all countries to promote prosperity while protecting the environment. They range from poverty to clean energy, responsible consumption. There's 17 of them. They're graphically identifiable, and they are being used to help explain and clarify corporate and nonprofit initiatives. VF uses these to align with their strategies and goals so you can know where they're applying their actions. And as we turn the corner and get closer to home, things start to feel a bit more bleak. It's 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, releases a landmark report that highlights the need to accelerate global climate change action. In the report that was prepared by the world's leading climate scientists, they warn that we have only 12 years, probably closer to 10 now, left for global warming to be kept to a maximum of 1.5 degrees Celsius, beyond which even half a degree will significantly worsen the risk of drought, floods, extreme heat, and poverty for hundreds of millions of people. 12 years, 10 years, not very far along, right? I often wonder where my kids will be in their career stage. 2019, we achieve a gloomy landmark in our climate history. Oh, and I'm sorry if you haven't watched this one, Before the Flood on climate change, a really good watch as well. 2019, we achieve a gloomy landmark in our climate history, though. Just last month, July was the hottest month ever recorded on planet Earth. This came from NOAA, which tallied up global and land and sea temperature recordings from 2019's 7th month and compared it to its 140-year data set, which stretched back to 1880, just a few years before the Sierra Club was formed. So, how does all this relate to what we do? Well, let's have a look at the top, seemingly universally accepted and most pressing environmental concerns that we face as a species. As you'll soon see, our industry connects to all of them. I think you will see that these connections, think to yourself where you think our connections are made here. So, biggest topics that we have to address as a species: climate change, deforestation, loss of biodiversity, air, soil, and water pollution, soil erosion, and species extinction. So, climate change, just to make sure we're all talking about the same thing. Climate change is a change in global or regional climate patterns that's been apparent from the mid to late 20th century. It encompasses global warming, but it refers more to the broader range of changes that are happening to our planet, including rising sea levels, shrinking glaciers, accelerating ice melt, and shifts in plant blooming times. What's driving it? Namely global warming, which is its own thing. Global warming is an increase in the planet's overall temperature over time due to the burning of fossil fuels, such as natural gas, oil, and our friend from the Industrial Revolution, coal. Burning these materials releases certain heat-trapping gases, or GHGs, into Earth's atmosphere. These gases trap heat from the sun's rays inside the atmosphere, causing Earth's average temperature to rise and then drive climate change. Deforestation, the irresponsible and mass destruction of and unsustainable clearing of forest areas that ultimately affects wildlife, ecosystems, weather patterns, and even climate. We call the Amazon the lungs of the planet for a reason, and in fact, planting more trees is a serious part of our climate solution portfolio. Super valuable. Loss of biodiversity. Biodiversity is the variety of life in the world or in a particular habitat or ecosystem. And biodiversity, as Cradle to Cradle points out, is strength, and monoculture is weak, and so biodiversity is crucial to healthy ecosystems, which are a system or a group of interconnected elements formed by the interaction of a community of organisms with their environment. So as a reminder, We are all connected, and it is all connected as well. Air, soil, and water pollution, just by definition, pollution is defined. It's the presence or the introduction into the environment of a substance or thing that has harmful or poisonous effects, not anything that we need in our air, soil, or water. Soil erosion, the wearing away of topsoil. Topsoil is the layer of soil that is the most fertile because it contains the most organic, nutrient-rich materials. Erosion often leads to eutrophication, which is on your term sheet that you guys got. What's that? Think of aquatic dead zones. It's a process by which a body of water becomes overly enriched in dissolved nutrients. The excess nutrients stimulate the growth of aquatic plant life and usually results in the depletion of oxygen, creating those dead zones. And as for topsoil, well, half of what was available has been lost in the last 150 years. Just generating 3 centimeters of topsoil takes 1,000 years. And scientists say if current rates of degradation continue, all of the world's topsoil could be gone within 60 years. And then species endangerment and extinction. More plants and animals are threatened with extinction now than at any other period in human history. Recent studies have shown that since 1990, reptiles, birds, mammals, we're losing them faster than we ever have. For all vertebrate groups together, the average rate of species loss is 53 times higher than the average or normal benchmark rate. So, what does the apparel industry have to do with it? Well, it ends up everything. It's really important to remember that our impacts occur at every single stage of the supply chain, and that they tally up greater in some parts than others. So when you look at the supply chain here, we start with the cradle, right? This is the birth of our materials. This is where things start. And when we do a life cycle assessment, we often go from either cradle to gate, and then after the gate comes the grave. So we've got tier 4 where our raw materials are, tier 3 where the raw material processing happens, tier 2 where we prepare those goods, we dye those goods, tier 1 is where things are manufactured and assembled, tier 0 are operations, distribution, retail, etc. The gate where we send them to market. And then we go into end of life and consumer use and end of life. And then after that, what do we have to do with our goods? Something has to be done with them. That's the grave. So we either go cradle to grave, cradle to grave. Cradle to gate, when we look at the environmental impacts, the biggest impacts that we have are associated with the furthest back we go, right? So raw materials, raw material processing, upwards of 65% of our environmental impacts come from back there. So that's really where we move the needle in making decisions back there. But no matter what, in each of those areas, we know that our goods have multiple impacts. If we look back here, the biggest fibers that we use, cotton, polyester, viscose, and leather. Well, cotton associated with eutrophication, water use, land use, soil degradation, water pollution, pesticides, fertilizers, inequity. The polyester and nylon that we use, it's basically plastic. So we have a reliance on fossil fuels, greenhouse gas emissions, microfiber pollution. Everybody aware of the microfiber pollution? It's tiny. It's different than microplastics, which are plastics, bigger pieces that degrade down smaller. Microfibers are coming from our synthetic goods. Every time we wash and wear them, they break off into tiny, tiny microscopic plastic bits that are going through our water filters and ending up in waterways all over the world, right? Viscose and rayon, man-made cellulosic fibers, come from trees. Sounds great until it's tied to deforestation and intense chemical use and dirty effluent. And then leather, the most impactful of all the fibers and proteins that we use, associated with deforestation, land use, emissions, soil contamination, water use, biodiversity loss. It's 1/3 of the planet's water use for that industry and 18% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Tier 2, the dyeing of our goods, massive amounts of chemicals. There we are. Likely restricted by those who have done the research, and we have untreated effluent that we're often dealing with. And then labor at tier 1, let's face it, it's been a race to the bottom. We need goods made cheaper. A living wage, according to Oxfam, should be enough money to provide a worker and their family with food, shelter, healthcare, clothing, transportation, electricity, and water, childcare and education, plus a little left over, and that should be earned in no more than 48 hours a week. Most brands, they say, though, however, aren't meeting that standard at all, and according to an article in Sourcing Journal, on average, only 4% of the price of an article of clothing sold goes toward garment workers' wages. That report found that often 40 cents on a $10 t-shirt goes to workers, and in Bangladesh, that percentage drops as low as 2%. Workers often earn as little as 33 cents an hour. Tier 0, paper linked to deforestation, our paper packaging, plastics, shipping and transportation, emissions, pollution. Air is much worse than boat, and probably nobody is using sails to send their things yet, so some might, but that's the best way to go. Paddleboard could work as well. Consumer use and end of life, we are buying too much, we're using it too little, we're disposing of it, left without any recycling solutions, And as I mentioned, we are releasing plastic microfibers into our water streams every time we wear and wash our plastic-based clothing. And beyond this, perhaps more conceptually and more systemic, the list is large. So there you can see we are tied to all those top concerns at every stage. But volume is increasing as we face overconsumption and underutilization. It's between 1 and 7 wears before we dispose of our goods. And with no signs of slowing, we have a reliance on virgin and finite inputs. We're working under a linear system without, at this time, an end-of-life collection process with very little recycling. Wasteful and polluting wages in the supply chain are low, perhaps minimum, but definitely below living wages. Discrimination exists, unsafe and unfair working conditions exist, and yes, forced and child labor still exist. We have hazardous chemicals that we're working with. We can be associated with deforestation. A lot of water use. 20% of the global wastewater is from the apparel industry. And greenhouse gases, upwards of 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions are tied to the apparel industry. That's more than all the international flights and maritime shipping trips combined. Waste is created at every stage. Upwards of 85% of textiles end up in landfills or are incinerated. And 60% of those are thrown away within a year of being made. We contribute to the plastic pollution problem. We have toxic and persistent chemicals in the environment. Hopefully everybody is up to speed on the PFCs that have been in most of the DWR coatings that we have been using over the last few years. There's a lack of traceability and transparency, two different things, right? The idea to be able to trace your supply chain all the way back, transparency to let people know where those things came from. Unethical treatment of animals, diminishing durability, lack of accountability and measurement, and maybe more, but who's keeping track, right? Well, actually, these guys are. If you want to learn more, reinforce any of it, fact check it, or just stay up to speed, I suggest diving into these reports, subscribing to the magazines and stuff that I'll put up here. But Greenpeace does a great job of putting out great updates and reports. The Global Fashion Agenda is putting out the Pulse reports every year. Ellen MacArthur Foundation putting together reports on circularity. There's Fashion for Good done by Cradle to Cradle. We have the Fashion Revolution putting out a report on transparency and traceability. And also these, Eco-Textile News Magazine. If you're not already subscribed, I highly recommend that you do. That's where you're going to get all of your good sustainability industry-specific news. Sustainable Brands, Green Biz, some great podcasts are out there, Conscious Chatter, Big Closet, Small Planet, Wardrobe Crisis, Mine, The Underswell. You can hear great conversation I had with Kim. And also these, there are great blogs out there, great resources. The UN has the Sustainable Development Goals app. You can trace what you're doing and line them up to some of the goals. The Tree, a new organization that's connecting consumers with great brands that are doing good things. And then NASA has a really good, great site dedicated to climate change. So, what are we going to do about it? It's a lot. And I don't mean to drop gloom on you guys, but it has not been a pretty picture. The good news, though, is that you guys are here. Did I do that? You guys are here. We've come together. Collaboration is key as we address the systemic problems that we have been dealing since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, right? And as we'll see, though, sustainability is about a triple bottom line approach. So yes, it's about the environment, it's about our planet, and it's about our business. Our businesses have to be sustainable in order to do the change that we want to do, but ultimately it is about us people. And all of our speakers today are going to talk on one of these and connect their talks to one of these topics. So I'm really glad to have them. We're going to have some great talks today. But before we move on, I'll leave you with two words that I want you to consider: ethics and negligence. Ethics, as we know, is this idea of the difference between right and wrong. Ethics is also about just doing the right thing. And then negligence. As my favorite book that I showed to you, Cradle to Cradle, asks, they say, should manufacturers of existing products feel guilty about the complicity in this destructive agenda? They ask, we know what to call doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different outcome is, right? Well, how about negligence? This, they say, is doing the same thing over and over, even though you know it is dangerous, stupid, or wrong. Now that we know, it's time for a change. Negligence, they say, starts tomorrow. That's from Cradle to Cradle. So I can't wait to hear from the rest of our speakers. We're going to have a great day today. Thank you guys for being here. I'll be around for questions, clarifications on any of this. Until then, thank you very much.